So this afternoon, I was tasked to discuss using Indigenous Filipino construct for management research. But before I go into my discussion, pakilala ko pa rin siguro ang sarili ko, no? So let me introduce myself further so you'll understand more the context in which this presentation was prepared. So I'm with the UP Department of Psychology, UP Diliman, where I teach, among other subjects, industrial and organizational psychology. In addition, this is probably the reason why Dr. Tihanki invited me to speak before you this afternoon. I am an advocate of Philippine psychology, or Sikolohiyang Pilipino, which I will explain further in a few more minutes. So I was invited to share my experiences as a researcher in one research project I did with the Pambansang Samahan sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino in partnership with the People Management Association of the Philippines, or more popularly known as PMAP. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this afternoon, I hope to be able to achieve the objectives written on the slides, given the time that we have. But before I go to the topic I was assigned to tackle, I will talk a little bit about the context in which this paper was written. Next slide, please. So in preparation for this afternoon, I went through some papers written and studies conducted that talked about management principles and practices done in the Philippines. I found that the studies could be put under three possible classifications. First, there are studies that unapologetically use Western paradigms to try and understand and predict Filipino management and worker behavior. Another group of researchers talk about indigenous concepts that describe Filipino personality traits. Ito yung the green box, no? And popular Filipino values and how they operate in business organizations. So a lot of these papers written were actually only observational and or anecdotal, or a revalidation of classic studies done in the late 90s, 80s, 90s, up to the early years of 2000. So the third classification, actually I revised this. The third classification, yung red na oval, okay, would be studies done using a clearly Filipino perspective and framework. So that is the title of the oval, no? Studies using a Filipino perspective and framework. So not necessarily starting with any theories, but using results of empirical studies as building blocks for creating theories. So examples for this include the studies done by the Ateneo Center for Organizational Research and Development, or CORD, and the Pambansang Samahan sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino, or PSSP. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I also paid attention to what practitioners had to say about the available literature on management practice. I found that there were many observations about the limitations of using Western-oriented theories and methods in many of the researches conducted. So for example, Dr. Tihanki, in his article entitled Culturally Sensitive Leadership in the Philippine Setting, said that the manager who leads in a Filipino setting needs to understand this delicate interplay of influences on the Filipino worker psyche. Mayer in 2006 said that Asian scholars ought to be more careful in applying theories developed in other contexts, and they can be more self-confident in exploring locally relevant research issues. Next slide, please. Sorry. Hold on for a minute. Okay. So Helbo said that Filipino style of management is basically a gaya-gaya of successful and time-tested practices in other cultures. And in a book published by Cord entitled Understanding the Filipino Worker and Organization, in the preface, they said that most of our education in organizational psych features organizational theories that were developed in the West. Yet, in applying these theories to our local organizations, we have experienced both hits and misses. Context is key to knowing and understanding workers and organizations. So they all point out to a need to turn to the local context or to indigenize research. Next slide, please, Ian. So our realization is that Western theories may provide knowledge and direction in order to understand behavior, but it shouldn't mean that the same variables are actually important to us in the Philippine context. So local business challenges and indigenous traditions provide richer, if not more valid sources of knowledge. So ito yung ating rationale for wanting to do research using the local setting and probably indigenous methods of research. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So this is where I'd like to talk about the framework of Sikolohiyang Pilipino. If you remember, there were two boxes and an oval much earlier showed by Ian, I mean, in my slide, not Ian. Okay, that says that there are studies that are actually done using a Filipino perspective. So I'd like to focus on this perspective or this framework, the framework of Sikolohiyang Pilipino. So Sikolohiyang Pilipino is actually an area under psychology, of course. It's also called Philippine psychology. So it's a scientific study of psychology derived from the experiences, ideas, and cultural orientation of the Filipinos. While it started as a movement within psychology and other related disciplines in the 1970s, its aim was to address the colonial background of psychology in the Philippines. But it has grown so much since the mid-1970s. It just celebrated recently its anniversary. But it continues to have the following goals. Next slide, please. So SP wants to develop indigenous concepts and frameworks. One of the goals is to adapt, develop, and use culturally appropriate instruments and methods. And also to apply indigenous psychology in health practices, agriculture, art, mass media, religion, business, etc. So sorry, I'm having a bit of a problem, technical problem with my notes. Give me a few minutes. All right, thank you. All right, so next slide, please. So the core concept, I will now go into the core concept used in Filipino psychology. You might have heard about this in other studies. So let me just talk very briefly about the core concept of kapwa. So Enriquez defined kapwa as a recognition of shared identity or an inner self shared with others. So it's not like our usual understanding of the word kapwa when we translate kapwa as the others. So it is not others as it connotes a separation of self from the others. So kapwa is actually the exact opposite. It is a sharing of yourself and others. So based on this idea, Virgilio Enriquez, he's called the father of Philippine psychology, develop a model that tried to list Filipino values that were essential in the cultivation of everyday relationships and may be seen in both personal and professional transactions in varied settings. This model discusses concepts like hiya, pakikiramdam, bahala na, pakikibaka, utang na loob, pakikisama, kagandahang loob, karangalan, katarungan, kalayaan, etc. and explains their implications in people's behaviors. Next slide, please. So to distinguish kapwa as a core concept, pakikipagkapwa is also mentioned in the model as the process one goes through in order to establish good relationships with others. So it is actually pakikipag-ugnayan sa kapwa, no? That is pakikipagkapwa. It is the key to the theme that it is the guide for what is called kapwa management. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so based on the model, many researchers doing work in the area of industrial and organizational psychology have come up with another concept called kapwa management. Okay, so in one art, I will quote one article, no, trying to describe what kapwa management is. No? So kapwa bilang paraan ng pamamahala sa pamamagitan ng pagpapamalas ng mga pagpapahalaga, katulad ng pananagutan, malasakit at bayanihan. Ito ay paggamit ng mga konsepto katulad ng pakikiramdam, pakikipagkapwa-tao, kagandahang loob, pagkamakatao, at iba pa. So kapwa management was conceived as a way of managing organizations and their human resources with a view of using Filipino values as a guide or inspiration for policies and practices. It emphasizes the sharing of the self and others in looking after the welfare of the people running and working in organizations. So I'd like to underscore that, no? Looking after the welfare of the people running and working in organizations. Okay, next slide, please. So I will now be talking very soon about the study that we did, which focused on pananagutan, malasakit, and bayanihan. So these were Filipino values that were highlighted in a study sponsored by PMAP and undertaken by PSSP. Next slide, please. Okay. So we organized 3 teams to explore the meanings and applications of the 3 Filipino concepts mentioned earlier. So we did 3 separate independent researches, no? In organizations that were selected from a list of corporations included in the list of top 100 Philippine corporations. So the list was provided by PMAP. So PSSP was given free rein to design and conduct the study using SP principles and methods. There's a hand raised. Should I address that need first to answer the question? Ian, pwede ko na bang sagutin mo na yun o mamaya na lang?
Hey, Ms. Jang, I think the one who raised their hand is, wait, let me just, it's Dr. Fideliaga. Dr. Fideliaga, do you want to, I will allow you to talk if you have a question for Ms. Jang at this juncture. Okay.
Something has to be clarified.
Oh wait, that the hand was already lowered. You can continue on po. Yes po.
Sige, sige. All right. So yeah, next slide please. Yeah, next slide na. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the research methodology used in this study. Okay. So the study used multiple methods of research using a combination of methods traditionally used in a lot of social researches. No? So the methods were mostly qualitative in nature. So these, excuse me. could be said to be similar, if not the same, as traditional methods of research. No, like for example, we use structured interviews, and also in addition to that, pakikipagkwentuhan. We also use ginabayang talakayan, which is actually a modified version of focus group discussion. So you're probably asking what makes them different from each other. Okay, so I will answer that question a little later. On the data gathering, from the data gathering method, the distinctive feature was introducing the element of reducing the psychological distance between the researcher and participants. Okay, usually, in traditional methods of research, the researcher or the investigator seems to occupy a higher status than the participants, no? But with the modification of the traditional methods of interviewing and FGD, the distance between the researcher and the participants were reduced. No? I can go into the details later. Okay, so why did we do that? This situation allowed an informality in the research situation. It allowed interviewers and facilitators to share their own views on issues being discussed. This was in support of the idea that participants who felt more at ease with facilitators would give more truthful and valid responses to questions. Okay? As for the data analysis, this method allowed the validation of initial impressions and conclusions by participants and stakeholders instead of just relying on the observations of researchers. Okay, next please. Next slide. Yeah. Okay, so let me go through very fast the results of one study. Okay, because there were 3 separate studies, but I'll just be talking about the study on pananagutan. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. After we were done with the research, we had to submit research reports to PMAP. So our reports were originally written as technical research reports, but we were asked to rewrite them, okay? So to speak, we were asked to laymanize them for this book, which PMAP published in 2012, no? You can see the title, Forging Management Excellence on the Anvil of Culture. So anyway, we were asked to laymanize or simplify a lot of the text in order to reach a wider audience composed of HR practitioners, managers, and employees. So this is consistent with the SP mission of making knowledge available to stakeholders and not just academics who read research journals. Okay, next slide, please. So I will be going the 10 things. So this is just a summary of the results of the independent study done on pananagutan. So the first, excuse me, the first thing is pananagutan is meeting responsibilities. No? So tuparin mo ang pangako mo. So the 4 bullet points here actually try to discuss or describe what is meant by meeting responsibilities. So pagtupad sa pangako, excuse me, fulfilling promises in English, of course, performing one's duties as expected, and delivering what is required. Next, please. So taking responsibility for something. So, excuse me, kasalanan ko. So owning up to personal mistakes, facing consequences of actions and decisions, correcting mistakes. This resembles accountability, but there's a distinction, which you will know when we go into the third one. So the next slide, please. So accountability, excuse me, accountability is kung hindi, lagot ka. So it means doing what should be done, and if you're unable to meet obligations, then you are, you should face consequences. So yun yung accountability. Next, please. So sharing in the consequences, sasagutin kita. So this actually focus more on what supervisors had to do. So supervisors had to make sure subordinates meet company objectives, and if there is any excuse me, um, negative consequence, supervisors have to share in the blame. Next slide, please. So pananagutan is reciprocal and egalitarian. Lahat ay may pananagutan. So all parties in an organization shoulders obligations and meets responsibilities. So each level is answerable to each other, from the top management up to the lowest level, okay, in the organization. They're all answerable to each other. So employees' recognition of their responsibilities towards the company, co-employees, and customers or clients are also included in this description. Next slide, please. So pananagutan should be fair, yung dapat. So your organization should provide legally mandated compensation and benefits. The organization should look out for employee welfare and protection of rights. And there should be a venue for employee grievances and due process. Next slide, please. Okay. Looking out for employees' personal growth and welfare. The goal of any organization should be magkaroon ng magandang buhay ang mga empleyado o nagtatrabaho sa organization. So this goes beyond monetary compensation. It also talks about organizing programs to strengthen knowledge and skills of the employees. And lastly, it means fostering the values of volunteerism and social responsibility. Okay, next please, number 8. Pananagutan requires commitment. Hindi ka pwedeng bumitaw. So employees and supervisors should have the tenacity to address the demands of meeting responsibilities. They should see a task to its completion, and everything should be towards reaching a noble cause. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Pananagutan entails being explicitly stated or documented. So dapat nakasulat. Arrangement should be formalized. Actors need to be informed of expectations. Although the norms can be negotiated, so that one clearly knows when there is a breach of the agreement. Okay, next slide, please. The last one. Okay. An agreement may kasamang, that's kasamang kasunduan. There should be an agreement between or among members of the organization that they should conform to a standard or meet certain obligations. So a failure on the part of one means a failure for both parties. Okay, so those were the 10 things. Okay, so to illustrate how pananagutan is pakikipagkapwa in action, I'll just describe here one. Next slide, please. Sorry. Okay, I just describe one actual situation in one organization, no, when pananagutan became evident. No, so one company implements programs to ensure the welfare of its employees. No, so it could be health and safety of employees. So examples would be giving them health insurance, or issuing safety guidelines in the workplace, or thinking of benefits like housing that goes beyond the demands of the law. Okay, next slide, please. So what happens when pananagutan is not present in an organization? So the participants actually gave these responses. No? They said that there would be the likelihood of breakdown of the team and working relationships. Companies that don't give employees what they deserve may risk employee misbehaviors and retaliation. Okay, an employer's kawalan ng pananagutan may lead to his or her termination. And lastly, kawalan ng pananagutan may result in negligence, absenteeism, and low quality of work from employees. Okay. Next slide, please. So last word on pananagutan. This tries to summarize what we gathered from the responses from the participants. So it is a relationship between individuals or groups of people based on both written and unwritten parameters, depending on where these interactions happen. Pananagutan is a prerequisite to being proven a worthy member of humanity. Okay, so I just want to reiterate that these were based on actual responses from participants who were either part of focus group discussions or were interviewed individually. Okay, next slide please. Okay, so yun yung huling slide ko sa pananagutan. So you probably want to ask, can we do this? Can we do a similar study? How do we use SP as a framework for doing our own research? How do we use the research methods espoused by the SP framework? Okay, so I tried to guess, okay, the issues that you will be raising. No? So the question is, how do we do it the SP way? So the SP way does not mean abandoning Western theories and methods of research. Okay, it just suggests that we use what is appropriate and useful for us to better understand the Filipino situation. So pwede natin gamitin yung Western theories kung akma siya, o pwede nating unawain yung mga pagkilos natin. Yeah. Next point, the welfare of the participants takes precedence over any information taken from them. So yung rights ng participants are always foremost, should always be foremost in our minds when we do the research. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide emphasizes, okay, what we can do about the concepts that we want to study. There are two ways of doing indigenization as far as research is concerned. So Enriquez talks about indigenization from without. Okay, the other concept is indigenization from within. Let me talk about the first one first. No? So the most common approach used in knowledge and technology transfer is indigenization from without. So ito yung pinaka-popular, ginagamit nito ng maraming pag-aaral. No? It is when we search for local equivalents for the assumed universal psychological concepts or the contextualization of important methods and techniques and tools and instruments. So this one is, excuse me, describes the second box which I presented earlier. No? So previous studies which tried to look at Western concepts and theories and tried to look at the Filipino setting, whether these theories or concepts would be applicable to us. So in a sense, it's like a cultural validation. So it happens outside. Is it a universal concept? Can we apply it to the local Philippine concept? So that is one way of doing it. No? Next slide, please. So the next one is indigenization from within. So this formalizes Filipinos' implicit theological theories, knowledge, methods, and practices developed with the local culture as source. So it's also called cultural revalidation. This is when we take concepts, Filipino concepts that we're familiar with, something that we use on a daily basis, something that's being talked about in organizations but never really studied seriously. So in the context of research, we can take a look at these concepts and see if they're applicable, workable, okay? Or we can look for actual experiences which can explain this Filipino concept. So that's indigenization from within. Okay, next please. Okay, so how do we do it, the SP way? Okay, so Sikolohiyang Filipino promotes what we call sama-samang pananaliksik. Okay, so the traditional model of research is merang researcher, marami siyang alam, mas marami siyang alam dun sa mga kalahok. He or she is the expert. He or she knows which questions to ask, what topic to study, how to analyze the data, etc., etc. But sama-samang pananaliksik says that researchers and participants are equals. Okay, so even participants can be considered higher in status than researchers because they're the ones who provide you the knowledge and the information that you want to know. So this is one aspect that is taken into consideration when you craft or you design your research design or your methods. Okay, so taking into consideration how much the participants actually contribute to the research. Okay, so next is indigenous research methods are alternatives to gathering data. So in our research on Pananagutan Malasakit ng Bayanihan, we did use traditional methods like interviewing and FGD, but we also used alternative methods like pakapa, pagkatanong-tanong, pakikipagkwentuhan, and we also suited the language of the research to the participants. So using Filipino rather than English in instances where the participants were more comfortable in using Filipino. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what is actually important in the researches that we conduct when using the SP framework is SP is built on psychological knowledge that arose from within the culture, reflects local behaviors, can be interpreted within a local frame of reference, and yields results that are locally relevant. And lastly, next slide, please. I think that management research should be maka-Pilipino and mapagpalaya. Okay. So again, this is the SP paradigm, which puts the welfare of Filipinos, especially the upliftment of the masses and working class, as one of its primary agenda. As to what the implications of these are to management research and practices, I would very much like to hear from you. Okay, and next slide, please. That ends my discussion on the assigned topic. If there are any questions, I would I'm ready to answer them. Ian.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jang. We actually have a few questions in line. So
Okay.
we have one from Dr. Tihanki. He asks, as business educators, how can we help the next generation of business leaders to have the ability to master pakikipagkapwa?
Okay. Pakikipagkapwa in particular is probably inherent in Filipinos. Well, the theory says that, but I'm not sure if in practice and this present generation is still able to grasp the meaning of pakikipagkapwa, but it's supposedly inherent in us as Filipinos, no? But I think if it were in a classroom setting, for example, it would be good for teachers to point this out, maybe in giving specific examples that can be found in business settings, or even everyday settings, I guess, no, to start with. Sabi mo nga, Dr. Tihanki, we start with, when you're driving, you start with something that's simpler, no? So pointing out siguro examples of pakikipagkapwa in everyday settings, then moving on to classroom settings and moving on to business settings. So pakikipagkapwa, using kapwa management actually focuses on how you're able to put the kapwa in mind when you're talking about programs, policies, practices, no? It's almost always nangunguna sa ating diwa o nakikita natin na ang business, for example, ay hindi para sa atin lamang, pero dapat sinasagot din yung mga pangangailangan ng ating kapwa. I'm trying to answer this from the SP perspective. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense. Did I answer your question, Dr. Tiangki?
Yes, very well, of course, Jang.
Incidentally, magkasama kami ni Dr. Tiangki sa PSSP.
Yes.
He was president of PSSP how many years ago?
2011 ba yun? I was president in 2011. Kasi si Ver Enriquez was my thesis advisor sa college.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yung buong thesis defense ko, mas marami siyang tinatanong kaysa dun sa panel.
Okay.
That was Ver Enriquez.
Okay. So, should we read those written in the Q&A?
All right. So we have another question from Bea de Ocampo. She asks, pagtupad sa pangako or word of honor is one value that seems to be fading in the Pinoy culture given the political climate. How do you think can this situated back into the original Sikolohiyang Filipino, especially as the new generations may already be so used with words not being honored?
Yeah. Okay. I agree with you that the present situation has moved us further and further away from how it was. I think during our grandfather's generation, palabra de honor meant something. So given the current situation, I think the older generation has a responsibility to teach the younger generation about this value. It's probably difficult, no, at this point to ask parents to do this in a formal way, but I think this is an opportune time for those in the teachers in the classroom, no, to find ways again of exploring this concept and giving examples, no, of how you can find it in the present setting, and maybe even, well, using as examples situations that are the opposite of palabra de honor or nahahalata yung edad ko, napaka dated ng aking what did you use in the palabra de honor, word of honor? Okay. So I think it falls on the shoulders of our generation, okay, to show the younger generation the importance of this concept. Well, if you want to do research on this is really a great topic. It's really important, if you do find, important findings or findings based on empirical research, this can be taught in classrooms, this can be published. This can also be a basis for policies of agencies, local agencies, no, that can help mold the minds of young people. Because the minds of young people are so pliable or impressionable. So if, the negative aspect of word of honor is always evident, okay, in social media, this is what will be imbibed by the young people. So maybe our role here is to bombard them with the opposite, no? Bombard them with instances or occasions or examples of how important word of honor is. No? Yes, I hope I answered your question.
All right. And then from Jess Renieses, Is it possible to look into the relationship between an indigenous construct and the Western or foreign one? If yes, what are the things we should be mindful of when doing the research?
Yeah. Yes, no, we can actually do that, no? Sabi nga ni Dr. Enriquez, it doesn't mean that you forget everything Western or abandon, as I said in one of the slides, na abandon Western theories. It's just important that we choose how we use, okay, the knowledge and the methods we get from the Western perspective. Meron kaming ginagamit na term yung angat patong, no? Angat patong approach, as in yung from apples to ano na nga yun, apples to banana approach ba, apples to mansanas approach, no? So it shouldn't merely be just translations or trying to find validation of Western concepts in the local setting, no? We should go beyond that, no? But let me go back to what I originally said. Yes, you can. You can use Western theories, you can use Western methods, but always have in mind that you are trying to look for a validation of these concepts in the Philippine perspective. Okay, yung local experiences, no? And then the second part of the question, how do we do it? Yun ba yun? Sorry, can we go back to the second?
Yes. How do we
Ano na nga yung tanong niya? How do we go?
what are the things we should be mindful of when doing this research? Yes.
Okay. Yeah, first of all is to, do more than reading Western literature. So turn to local literature. Marami nang available, no? So read up on local studies. So I'm sure meron mga local studies on business, local studies on human relation, practices, etc. So you're exposed to a wider range of ideas, not just the Western perspective, no? Kasi if we rely on textbooks, there are, I think, fewer local textbooks found compared to Western textbooks written by Western authors, no? So if you're just exposed to that, it limits your knowledge and the lens that you can use to understand behavior and psychological phenomenon, for example, no? So that's the first thing you can do. Shop around, look around, ask around, and then choose. Okay, make an informed decision. No? Choose which ones you think are applicable or useful. And then you can also start from, there's an approach that we call bottom-up and top-to-bottom approach. SP actually espouses a bottom-up approach, in that you don't have to start with a theory, you don't have to start with a concept that's already been studied. In fact, Dr. Enriquez pushed us to study, for example, what he called larangan lexical or lexical domain. We did studies choosing concepts or phrases of words, and then trying to come up with descriptions that came from interviewees. So without using any textbook, without using any related literature, we came up with our description, we came up with our explanations. So ito yung bottom-up approach, no? Meaning that based on what you discover, you can come up with your own theories, no? Based on empirically derived responses. No? So I think that's the next step. And then try to study, open your minds to the possibility of using methods that are maybe non-traditional. Okay, so go beyond structured interviews, go beyond questionnaires, go beyond surveys. Okay, you can use those taught in SP, or you can even come up with your own methods that you think will be able to capture data that are necessary. No? But if questionnaires are the more appropriate, go. No, you shouldn't stop there. No, just make sure that the questions there are relevant to the questions that you want to. I mean, to the topic you want to find out. Make sure that they're written in the language that your participants will understand. So I think that should be a good start. And don't be afraid, even if you do not have formal training in doing research. Okay, the SP framework is very kind to researchers who want to do research. Okay, non-researchers who want to do research. Of course, you have the benefit of being in classrooms, no? Having teachers to teach you the tenets of doing good research. No? But outside of the classroom, you shouldn't be afraid of doing research. Thank
And we
you.
have a question from Chris Hiso. He asks, how can this be applicable for us working in a global organization?
This is a global organization based in the Philippines with Filipino employees.
If Mr. Hiso, I can give you the chance to speak on the mic if you'd like, so you can clarify your question.
Yes. So I would like to understand, since this is more on a local construct, would like to understand, given the globalization, how this can, be helpful to us Filipino managers to influence global leaders.
So you are working in an organization based in the Philippines.
Based in the Philippines, but a global organizations with global presence. And most of our leaders were actually, expats, Western. So using this local construct, how can you think, will help this? How can this help us to influence, their mindset?
Yeah, the mindset of your managers or your workers.
Yes. Yes, mostly on the senior leaders.
Yeah. When working in a global organization, there is always the temptation to use the prevailing organizational culture of the leaders or of the owners, no. So if it's a kunyari, U.S. owned, okay, or Chinese owned, there is well, not really a temptation, but a tendency to adjust to the prevailing organizational culture espoused by the owners, for example, or the managers, no. But you're right in asking, how can you convince them, no? How can you let them know that it is just as important to take into consideration our local culture, no? There are organizations I know that make an effort to really have briefings or orientations for their foreign managers to try to understand local culture in order to become more effective at managing people or running organizations. No, well, in the area of training, this would be one possible method. No, so try to encourage them to attend these kinds of training. No, but if this is not possible, then there really is a need for you to communicate the importance of culture in having an effective organization. Yung focusing on the needs of your workers vis-a-vis cultural differences or cultural peculiarities is, for us in the HR discipline, very salient or very important factors for any organization to succeed. So this has to be communicated to your leaders if that's possible. Now, if you're going to be talking about research, of course, if there's an opportunity to do research, maybe this is one venue wherein you can explore, gathering information about local or Philippine values that can be helpful to the organization? Because you can put it that way. Do you want the organization to succeed, to prosper, or to earn, etc.? These are some ways by which we can probably use, sa mga pakinggan, no? Use, parang user-friendly, these are some values that we can encourage, okay, in order to contribute to the overall, not only to overall well-being of the employees, but the overall well-being of the whole organization. So in other words, I'm saying, iparating, ipaalam, iparamdam na importante yung kultura natin upang magkaroon ng epektibo na pamamaraan ng pamamahala sa isang organization. Ano? So don't be afraid to show that Filipino culture is an important ingredient in making sure that an organization will run well or will succeed. Okay, I hope that answers your question.
All right, so we have time for one final question. So there was a question earlier sent in the Q&A by Dr. Habaradas. He asks, isn't the concept others a direct translation of kapwa? I see kapwa as considering the other as part of oneself. Therefore, a manager who uses kapwa in his decision making sees not only how his actions affects others, it includes empathy. Do you agree?
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree, no? Because kapwa is a sharing of yourself with the others. So you cannot do anything without affecting the others. So yes, no, that's a most accurate description of kapwa in action in an organizational setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your question. So at this point, we'd like to thank Ms. Jang for spending her time with us and sharing her knowledge about Sikolohiyang Filipino and how it can be applied to management research. And we'd also like to present the Certificate of Appreciation. So this is awarded to Ms. Josefina Andrea R. Cantiller for facilitating the professional development webinar titled Using Indigenous Filipino Constructs for Management Research during the 8th National Business and Management Conference. So the theme of the conference is Reimagining the Next Normal, Business and Management in the Philippines During Times of Uncertainty, signed by Dr. Emilina Sorial, Dr. Antonio M. Lopez, and Dr. Oscar Bulaong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jang.
Thank you so much. I'm